3 men would freeze standing up that winter, still gripping the reins of horses that had already stopped breathing. The plains did that. They did not bury you. They left you upright, like a warning no one had time to read. A widow saw the sky go wrong before she felt it. She was 31, alone on a wagon seat, one tired mule ahead of her, a box of her father's tools behind. Everything else she owned had been sold to pay for a man who was no longer alive to thank her for it. The wind stopped, not softened, stopped. The kind of stillness that does not calm a person but empties them, because it means the air is being pulled somewhere far off, gathering into something that has not arrived yet. The mule refused to walk, and the woman stood up on the seat, looked north at a wall of cloud the color of a deep bruise, and understood that every plan she had made was already dead behind her on the trail. She had 2 hours, maybe less. What she did next would have looked, to anyone watching, like a woman who had given up. It was the opposite. The widow's name was Marit Halverson. She was 31 years old, though the trail had aged her hands past that. And on the morning the sky turned against her, she was driving a single mule wagon south through a country that did not care whether she lived. The country never did. That was the first thing it taught. She had been alone for 6 days. 6 days since she'd closed the door on a life that had quietly fallen apart around her. A husband gone, his debts left behind like furniture no one wanted, and a small pile of belongings sold off one piece at a time until almost nothing remained. What was left fit in the wagon? 2 wool blankets, a coil of rope, a water barrel lashed to the sideboards, and a tin canteen she kept closer than that, a little dried meat and hardtack, a heavy iron pot, and a box of her father's tools, worn smooth by his hands before they were ever worn by hers. That box was the one thing she had refused to sell. A person can let go of almost everything and still keep the one thing that remembers who they used to be. The mule walked. Marit watched the road. And for a while, that was the whole world. She was headed for her brother's place. Soren had a homestead somewhere south and east, past a river she had already crossed and a ridge she had not yet reached. He didn't know she was coming. There had been no way to tell him. She had simply pointed the wagon at the only family she had left and started driving. By her own count, she should have been closer by now. That was the thing that nagged at her. She had figured 8 days, maybe 10, but the river had cost her time. A cracked axle had cost her more. The mule was tired in a way that no rest seemed to fix. She was behind. She didn't like being behind. Out here, behind was not just a feeling. It was a margin. And margins were what kept a person breathing. The land that morning was wide and pale and empty. A long exposed ridge ran north to south beneath her wheels, falling away on one side into a shallow draw, broken on the other by low shelves of stone. No trees, no smoke, no roof line anywhere on the horizon to say that other people existed. Just grass, gone brown and brittle, and sky. She had grown used to the emptiness over the 6 days. There was a kind of bargain a person made with country like this. You gave up the comfort of being seen, and in return, the country let you alone with your own thoughts, which were not always a kinder companion. Marit had spent the 6 days learning that her thoughts, given that much room, went always to the same place. To a doorway, to a man's careless smile, to the sound a wind makes when it is about to take everything. She'd been trying to outrun that sound for years, and the country, that morning, was about to hand it back to her. The sky was the first thing to change. It didn't darken. Not at first. It flattened. The light went strange, as if someone had pressed the sun behind a sheet of iron and let it glow there, dull and far away. The shadows lost their edges. The color drained out of the grass. Marit had grown up beside cold water, in a house built by a man who read weather the way other people read scripture. She knew that flat light. She had seen it as a child, on a shoreline, in the hour before grown men stopped laughing and started running. She didn't run now, but something in her chest pulled tight. Then the wind stopped. Not softened. Stopped. One moment it had been there, steady and cold against her cheek, the way it had been for days. And the next, it was simply gone, as though the whole country had drawn a single breath and was holding it. The silence was wrong. Most people would have found it peaceful. A traveler with no eye for weather might have sighed in relief, glad to be free of the wind that had scoured them for days. Marit found it terrifying, because she understood what it meant. Still air was not calm air. Still air was air being pulled somewhere else, somewhere far off, beyond what the eye could reach. Pressure was gathering into a column, building and building. And when it broke, it would not break gently, and it would not break slow. The mule stopped walking. It just stopped. Ears back, head low, a tremble running through its flanks like a current through water. Marit had not pulled the reins. The animal had decided on its own. And in all her days on that trail, the mule had never once decided anything. She set the brake. She stood up on the wagon seat, one hand against the bowed frame for balance, and she looked north. What she saw, she would carry for the rest of her life. The horizon was no longer a line. It had become a wall, a vast, rolling, almost black mass of cloud, rising from the earth to the top of the sky, stretching from one edge of the world to the other. The color of it was not gray. It was the deep, ugly purple of a bruise gone days old. The color of something already hurt and getting worse. And at the bottom of that wall, where the dark met the ground, there was a pale gray smear, soft and shifting, almost beautiful. She knew what it was. Snow, driven sideways, already moving faster than any horse alive. For one long moment, Marit Halverson did not breathe, because she understood her position with terrible clarity. She was on an open ridge, no trees, no walls, no shelter, no settlement within a hard day's ride. A tired mule, a broken wagon, a handful of supplies, and a storm coming that did not negotiate. 2 hours. That was her guess. 2 hours. Maybe less. She had seen, once, what such a wind could do to a body left out in the open. Out here, exposure was not a slow thing. It did not give a person an evening to think it over. It came fast, and it came hungry, and it took the heat out of you faster than your own blood could put it back. People did not freeze the way the word made it sound. They didn't simply turn cold and drift off. They grew confused. They grew tired. They sat down because standing felt like too much. And then they didn't get up. She had heard the stories. Men found upright, still holding the reins of horses that had stopped breathing first, left standing on the plain like questions no one had been there to answer. She did not intend to become one of those questions. Marit climbed down from the wagon, slow, steady, the way her father had taught her to move when everything in her wanted to hurry. Panic, he used to say, in that low voice that never rose no matter how hard the wind blew, is just fear that stopped thinking. She walked to the mule's head. She placed both hands flat on the animal's face, feeling the warm breath, the trembling jaw, the wide, frightened eye. And then she did the strangest thing. She stood still. She did not whip the mule forward. She did not scan the land in a frenzy for somewhere to run. She simply stood there, breathing slow, her eyes moving carefully across the ground around her. Not the storm, the ground. To anyone watching from a distance, it would have looked like a woman who had given up. A woman frozen by fear, waiting for the end to come and take her. The truth ran the other direction entirely, because Marit was not looking for a place to hide. She was looking for something else, something most people in her place would never have thought to want. She was looking for walls. Her eyes traced the shelves of stone breaking the western edge of the ridge, low sandstone bluffs, weathered and shallow, no more than 12 or 15 feet high. She had passed a dozen like them all morning and never once turned her head. Now she studied them the way a person studies a closing door. Somewhere in her, very quietly, an old voice was speaking. A voice from a cold shore and a colder childhood, from a man with rough hands and endless patience who had once knelt beside her in the wind and taught her the one thing that would matter most on this ridge, on this morning, with this sky coming down. She could not yet see the whole of what she would do, but she could feel the shape of it beginning, the way you feel a decision before you have the words for it. The wind was still gone, the silence still held, and Marit Halverson, 31 years old and entirely alone, turned away from the storm and started walking toward the rocks. She had 2 hours. She did not waste a single second of the first one wishing things were different. That, more than anything, was why she would live. The grass crunched under her boots, stiff with the cold that had no wind to carry it. Marit walked toward the bluffs with the mule's lead rope loose in her hand, and the animal followed, head low, hooves dragging, as if it understood that the walking now had a purpose it hadn't had before. She did not look back at the storm. Looking back would not change its speed. And there was a thing her father used to say. On the bad mornings, when the sea came up black and the boats had to be hauled high, watch your hands, not the water. The water will do what it does. Your hands are the only part of this you own. So she watched the ground. She watched the rock. And as she walked, the old lessons began to come back to her. Not as words exactly, but as a kind of knowing in the body. The way a song you haven't sung in years still finds your mouth before your mind catches up. She had been a small girl on a cold shore once. A girl in a wool coat too big for her, standing on a headland beside a man who built boats for a living and shelters for the love of it. Below them, tucked into the face of the cliffs, were the little huts the fishermen used. Crude things, driftwood and hide, no bigger than a closet, no stove, no fire, no comfort of any kind. And men slept in them through nights that would have killed them in the open. How? The girl had asked. Her father had crouched down to her level, the wind tearing at both of them, and he had told her the thing she would spend the rest of her life proving true. "The cold doesn't kill you, little one," he'd said. "The wind does. Cold just sits there. It waits. A person can outlast cold for hours if the air is still." He had pointed to the huts. "But the wind reaches in and steals. It pulls the warmth right off your skin faster than your own body can make it. That's the thief. Not the cold. The wind." She had looked at the huts again. No fire, no stove, nothing to make heat at all. "Then what keeps them alive?" she'd asked. And her father had smiled, the slow smile he saved for the things that mattered most. "Walls," he'd said. "Just walls. A wall isn't there to make you warm. A wall is there to stop the theft. Every wall you put between yourself and the wind is a wall the wind can't rob you through." She had been 9 years old. She had never forgotten it. And now, more than 20 years later, on a ridge at the edge of nowhere, with a bruise-colored wall coming down out of the sky, those words were not a memory anymore. They were a plan. She reached the first formation and passed it without slowing. Too shallow. A scoop in the stone barely deep enough to sit in. The wind would find a person there in minutes, would curl into that little hollow and swirl and never leave. The second was no better. A long, flat face with no give to it, no shelter, nothing to break the air. She kept walking. The mule made a sound, low in its chest. Marit reached back without looking and laid a hand on its neck. "Soon," she said quietly. "I know. Soon." Her voice surprised her. She had not spoken aloud in 2 days. The third formation made her stop. It was wider than the others. The stone curved inward at the top, leaning out over a hollow that went back into the rock 6 feet, maybe more, at its deepest. The floor was dry, sheltered from above by the overhang, and the walls. She walked into it slowly, turning, looking up, looking back. Walls on 3 sides, left, right, and behind. Solid stone, old beyond counting, unbroken. The mouth of it faced east, away from the dark, away from the wind that was coming down out of the north and west, like a hand closing into a fist. 3 walls, already standing, already built. She stood in the center of that hollow and felt something rise in her that she had not felt in a very long time. Relief would have been too easy a word, and too early. What moved through her was closer to recognition. The strange, steadying feeling of a door opening exactly where a person had needed a door to be. 3 walls, she murmured, the way her father might have said it. 3 walls were 3/4 of the way to living, but 3/4 was not the same as whole. And out here, the difference between 3/4 and whole was the difference between walking out the other side of this and not. She needed a 4th wall. She turned and looked back the way she had come, across the open ground, to where the wagon sat small and alone on the exposed ridge. And that was when she heard it, a sound that did not belong. Hoofbeats, not the slow plod of her mule. Quick, many, coming up the trail from the south, the direction she'd been heading. Marit stepped out of the hollow and shaded her eyes. There were riders, 4 of them on horseback, and behind them a light wagon pulled hard by a team that was lathered and blowing. They were moving fast, moving the way people move when they have somewhere to be and not enough time to get there. They saw her wagon first, sitting alone, and slowed. Then they saw her, standing at the foot of the bluffs. The lead rider lifted a hand, not a wave exactly, more a gesture that said, "Stay where you are, we're coming to you." Marit waited. She did not run to them. She did not call out. Years had taught her something about people who came toward you fast and full of relief. Sometimes they were salvation, and sometimes they were just one more weight you'd be asked to carry, dressed up as company. The riders came up the slope and reined in, close enough now that she could see their faces. The lead man was big through the shoulders, with a heavy coat and a hat pulled low, and a beard going gray at the edges. He had the look of a man used to being listened to. The others hung back a little behind him, the way men do behind someone they've agreed to follow. In the wagon sat two more figures, bundled against the cold. A woman, maybe. A younger one beside her. "You alone out here?" the big man asked. The words came out shaped like a question, but they were not really a question. They were a judgment, with a question's clothes on. "For now," Marit said. His eyes went past her to her wagon, to the cracked axle, the torn canvas, the single tired mule. She watched him decide she was no one. "We're making for the settlement south," he said. "Hard riding, but we'll beat the weather if we don't stop. You'd best come along. That rig of yours won't make it through what's coming." She glanced at the sky behind him. The wall of cloud had grown. It was no longer a thing on the horizon. It had begun to climb, to lean forward at the top, curling over like a wave that had not yet decided to break. "How far is the settlement?" she asked. "Half a day, maybe less. The way we'll push it." Half a day. Marit looked at the storm again, then at his lathered horses, then at the curling top of that dark wall, and she shook her head slowly. "You won't beat it," she said. The words came out quiet, plain, the way her father said true things. The big man's face changed. "What?" "You won't beat it," she said again. "Look at the front of that cloud. See how the top of it leans? That's a fast storm, a steep one. It'll be on this ridge before you're halfway to your settlement." "And you'd know that, would you?" "I would." A few of the men shifted in their saddles. One of them laughed, short and uneasy, and looked at the others to see if it was all right to laugh. The big man did not laugh. He leaned forward over his saddle horn and looked at her the way a man looks at a thing that is wasting his time. "Let me understand you," he said. "We've got fast horses, a fresh team, and half a day of daylight. And you, with your broke-down wagon and your half-dead mule, are telling us to stop. Out here, in the open, with nothing." "I'm telling you that you can't outrun it," Marit said. "So you shouldn't try. You should get off this trail and get into the rocks. Find walls. Block the wind. The wind is the thing that kills out here, not the cold. The wind." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the big man laughed. There was nothing kind in the sound of it. "Walls," he said. "She wants us to hide in the rocks." He looked back at his men, and now they did laugh, because he had made it safe to. Like animals, like a den of foxes. "Like men who'd rather be alive in the morning," Marit said. The laughter stopped. The big man's eyes went hard. "You listen to me," he said, and he pointed a thick finger at her chest. "I have crossed this country more times than you've had birthdays. I don't need a widow alone on the road. A woman who can't even keep her own wagon together, telling me how to read a sky. You want to crawl into a hole and pray? You go right ahead. We've got somewhere to be." He pulled his horse around, but the woman in the wagon had been listening. She leaned forward, and Marit saw that she was older gray-haired, with a tired and frightened face. Beside her sat a younger woman, hardly more than a girl, who had not taken her eyes off Marit the whole time. "Caleb," the older woman called. "Maybe she's right. Maybe we should—" "She's not right," the big man snapped, not turning around. "She's scared, and she's alone, and she wants company so she doesn't have to die by herself. That's all this is." The words hung in the cold air, and something in Marit went very still, because there was a piece of truth buried inside the cruelty of it. Not the part he meant, a different part. A part he could never have known. She did not want to die alone. She knew exactly what dying alone looked like. She had watched it happen once, on a night she had spent years trying not to remember. The big man clucked to his horse and started down the slope, back toward the trail, back toward the open ground and the false promise of half a day. His men followed. Of course they followed. The wagon began to turn, and as it turned, the younger woman, the girl with the watching eyes, looked back at Marit over the sideboard. She did not say anything. She couldn't. The choice was not hers. But she raised one hand, just a little, not a wave goodbye. Something closer to an apology. Marit lifted her hand in return, and held the girl's eyes for as long as the turning wagon allowed. Then the wagon straightened out, and the team leaned into the harness, and they were gone. A knot of riders and a rocking wagon, pushing south down an open trail with a storm leaning over them like a wave about to fall. Marit watched them grow small. She watched them shrink to dots, then to nothing, swallowed by the gray, and she did not call after them. There was no point. She had said the true thing. They had chosen not to hear it. That was the oldest story she knew. She had spent her whole life saying true things to people who had already decided not to listen because of what she was: a daughter, a wife, a widow, a woman alone. People heard the shape of her before they heard the words. She stood there a long moment in the strange flat light, and the old ache rose up in her, the one she carried everywhere, the one she had been driving away from for 6 days and had not managed to lose. Because the thing was, she had said true things before. And the last time, the most important time, it had not been to a stranger on a trail. It had been to her husband. She did not want to remember it. She never wanted to remember it. But the mind is not a thing a person fully owns, and standing there, watching the doubters disappear into the gray, she could not stop it from coming. It had been a night like this one, the sky going wrong, the wind dropping out, that same terrible stillness. She had known. Even then, even younger, she had known. She'd felt the warning in her chest the way she felt it now, and she had gone to him and said the true thing. "Don't go out tonight. It's coming. I can feel it coming. Stay." And he had smiled at her, that easy, careless, lovely smile that she had married him for. And he had touched her face and told her she worried too much, that a little wind never hurt anyone, that he'd be back before it was even full dark. The work could not wait, he said. The work never could. She had stood in the doorway and watched him go, and the storm had come exactly when she said it would, faster than he believed, harder than he believed. And he had not come back before dark. He had not come back at all. They found him after. The details did not matter now. What mattered was the part she had carried every day since, that she had known. She had felt it coming, and she had said so, and she had been right. And being right had saved no one. Being right had only meant that she got to stand in a doorway and watch the man she loved walk out into a thing she had seen, and he had not. For a long time after, she told herself there was nothing she could have done, that a grown man makes his own choices, that she had warned him, and a warning is all one person can give another. But the telling never quite took, because underneath it lived a darker thought, the one that came at night, the one that no amount of reason could fully kill. If she had been more, if she had been a man with a man's voice, with a voice he had to listen to, would he have stayed? If she had grabbed him, fought him, blocked the door, screamed, would he be alive? She would never know. That was the cruelty of it. She would never, ever know. And so she had lived in the years after with the weight of a warning that came true and changed nothing, with the helplessness of having seen the storm and been unable to stop the one person who mattered from walking into it. That fear had a longer reach than any cold. It was not dying she was afraid of, not really, and not even the storm. What she feared was the helplessness itself, the horror of seeing the danger clearly, and clearly, and clearly, and still not being able to save anyone, not even herself. The wind was still gone. The riders were gone. And Marit Halverson stood alone on a ridge with a storm coming down, holding the lead rope of a tired mule, with that old wound torn open fresh in her chest. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel the full size of it, the loneliness of being right and unheard, the grief that never finished grieving, the fear that life was simply going to keep handing her storms she could see and could not stop. She let herself feel it. And then she did the thing her father had taught her to do with feelings that were too big to carry. She did not push it away. She did not pretend it wasn't there. She set it down, gently, the way you set down something heavy when you know you're going to have to pick it up again later, but you need both hands free right now. Later, she whispered to the ache. I'll carry you later. Right now, I have work. And she turned back to the rocks. Because here was the thing the big man had not understood. The thing none of them ever understood about a woman alone. She was not standing in those rocks because she was afraid to die alone. She was standing in those rocks because she had already learned, the hardest way a person can learn it, that she could not count on anyone to listen, to come, to save her. So she had stopped waiting to be saved. She had become the kind of woman who saves herself. The doubters had ridden off toward a settlement they would not reach, toward open ground and false hope and a storm that did not care how many times a man had crossed this country. She wished them well. She did. Whatever the world had tried to make of her, it had not made her hard enough to want them to suffer for not listening. But she could not follow them. Not because she didn't want company, because following them was a slower kind of dying. Half a day to the settlement, the storm coming in 2 hours, maybe less. The arithmetic was simple, and it was brutal, and it left her exactly one option. She was not going to reach safety, so she was going to build it, here, now, out of whatever this ridge would give her. Marit walked back into the hollow and looked at it again, harder this time, the way you look at a thing you're about to bet your life on. 3 walls of stone, old, solid, unmovable, a floor that was dry, a roof of overhanging rock that the snow could not reach past, and a mouth 18 feet wide, facing east, that the wind would pour through the moment it arrived, unless something stood in the way. She needed a 4th wall. She had no lumber, no tools for building, beyond the box her father had left her, no time to gather stone and stack it, even if the ground had offered loose stone, which it did not. She had a mule, a coil of rope, 2 blankets, a torn sheet of canvas, and out there on the open ridge, small and broken, and worth less than the animal that had pulled it, she had a wagon. A wrecked wagon, a cracked axle, a split sideboard, a tailgate hanging from one hinge, a thing no trader in the territory would have given $10 for. Marit looked at that wagon across the open ground, and where another person would have seen junk, she saw a wall. She did not see what the wagon was. She saw what it could become. That was the gift her father had truly given her, the one worth more than any box of tools, not the knowing of weather, not even the lesson about wind and walls. The gift was the eye that could look at a broken thing, a torn canvas, a cracked frame, a life that had fallen apart one sold-off piece at a time, and find not the wreckage, but the use still hiding inside it. The wagon could not be a wagon anymore. That was over. The axle was cracked, the wheel was bad, the canvas was torn. As a wagon, it was finished. But she did not need a wagon. She needed a wall. And a wall did not have to roll. A wall did not have to be strong, or whole, or beautiful, or anything at all, except complete. That was the second half of her father's lesson, the half she had not yet had cause to use today. A wall isn't there to be strong, he had told her, on that cold shore, all those years ago. Storms don't push walls down, not the kind that kill you. They reach through. They find the gap, the crack, the little open seam, and they pour in, and they steal. He had pressed his big, rough hand flat against the side of one of those fishermen's huts. A strong wall with a hole in it will get you killed, he'd said. A weak wall with no holes will save your life. You hear me, little one? It's not strong that matters. It's whole. Seal every gap. Close every seam. Leave the wind no way in, and the wind cannot rob you. Whole. Not strong. Complete. Marit looked at the storm. She looked at the wagon. She looked at the 18-foot mouth of the hollow and the broken thing across the ridge that could fill the heart of it, and the fear that had ridden her chest all morning, the old fear, the helpless fear, the fear of seeing the danger and being powerless against it, quietly changed shape. Because she was not powerless now. She could see the storm. Yes, same as always. But for the first time in a very long time, seeing it was not the end of what she could do. This time, she had hands. She had a plan. She had a wall waiting to be built, and an hour, maybe less, to build it in. This time, she was not standing in a doorway watching someone walk away. She was going to do something. Marit Halverson tied the mule's lead rope to a tough little juniper growing out of a crack in the stone. She spoke to the animal once, low, the old word her father had used with the draft horses, a word that meant stay. The mule's ears flicked. It stayed. She uncoiled the rope from her shoulder and looked at her own 2 hands. They were chapped and raw and not large. They had been doubted her whole life. They had failed once, to hold a door shut against a man who would not listen. But they were the only hands she had, and the storm was coming. "All right," she said quietly, to no one, to the wind that wasn't there yet, to the man who hadn't listened years ago, and the men who hadn't listened an hour ago, and to herself, most of all, to herself. "All right, let's build." And she ran out across the open ground toward the wreck that the world had thrown away, to make from it the one wall that would stand between her and everything that was coming. The wagon sat where she had left it, alone on the open ridge, like a thing already given up to the sky. Marit reached it, breathing hard, the rope coiled over her shoulder, and for one moment she simply stood beside it and looked. A whole life had ridden in this wagon, 6 days of it. And before that, in a way, all the years that had led her here. Everything she'd owned, everything she'd lost, everything she'd refused to let go of. And now she was going to take it apart with her own hands. There was no time to be tender about it. She crouched at the front and found the pin that held the cracked axle to the frame. It was rusted, stiff, fused half shut by cold and grit. She braced her boot against the wood and pulled. Nothing. She pulled again, throwing her whole weight back, the rope biting into her palms. The pin gave with a screech of metal, and she went down hard onto the frozen ground, the breath knocked half out of her. She got up. There was no one to see her fall, and no one to help her rise, and she had long ago stopped waiting for either. She got up, and she went to the back, and she found the second pin, and this time she was ready for the way it would let go all at once. The wagon bed dropped free of its running gear. It settled onto the frozen grass with a heavy, final thud. A long wooden box, open at the top, sideboards rising on every edge. The wheels and the cracked axles and the tongue lay scattered around it now, useless, finished, the bones of a thing that would never roll again. But the box was exactly what she needed. She put both hands on the edge of it and pushed. It did not move. She set her shoulder against it and drove with her legs. It shifted, barely, an inch, maybe 2, scraping against the frozen ground with a sound like a held breath. 300 pounds, maybe more. A weight no single person could carry, could lift, could move across open ground by strength alone. Marit stepped back and wiped the cold sweat from her forehead with the back of a raw hand. She was not going to lift it. She had never planned to lift it. She looked at the ground between the wagon and the hollow, 400 yards of it, and the slope, she saw now, ran gently downhill the whole way, down toward the rocks, down toward the 3 walls, waiting for their 4th, downhill. She almost laughed. For once, just this once, the land was on her side. She uncoiled the rope. 60 feet of braided hemp, worn soft in places. Her father's rope. The same rope that had hauled boats up out of cold water before she was ever born. She ran the rope through the stake pockets at the front of the wagon bed, knotted it twice, then looped the long ends across her own shoulders and around her chest, building a crude harness, the kind a person makes when there is no time to make a good one. She leaned forward until the rope went tight. And then she leaned forward more. The rope bit into her collarbone, into the soft flesh below her shoulders. She felt it the way you feel a thing that is going to leave a mark you'll find later and wonder at. She did not stop. She drove with her legs, bent almost double, her boots scrabbling for purchase on the frozen grass, every muscle in her back and her thighs and her shoulders screaming all at once. And the wagon bed moved. It scraped forward, slow, a few inches, then a foot, then, as the slope took it, a little easier, a little more. "That's it," she breathed to the wagon, to the rope, to herself. "That's it. Come on." She walked. She could not see where she was going. Bent that low, hauling that hard, all she could see was the frozen ground passing beneath her boots, inch by inch, scarred behind her by the long dark gouge the wagon bed cut in the frost. So she did not watch the storm. She did not watch the rocks. She watched her own 2 feet, one and then the other, and she trusted the slope to carry her toward the walls, and she let the work be the whole of the world, the way her father had taught her on the worst mornings. Watch your hands, not the water. But the water was getting louder. Not yet a sound, a pressure, a change in the air against the back of her neck. The flat iron light was darkening now, going from sick yellow towards something deeper, and the cold had begun to take on an edge it hadn't had before, a sharpness, a warning. She did not look up. She pulled. Her shoulders went past pain into something beyond it, a kind of numb burning that she knew was her body telling her it had given everything and was now spending what it did not have. Her hands had stopped feeling the rope. Her breath came in short white bursts that the air swallowed instantly. She thought about the girl in the wagon, the one who had raised her hand, the one who had wanted to listen and hadn't been allowed to. She thought, for one terrible second, about whether that girl was still alive out there on the open trail, or whether the storm had already found her. And then she set that thought down too, because she could not carry it, and the wagon both, and the wagon was the one she could actually move. She pulled. The rope wore through the wool of her coat and found her skin. She pulled. Her legs shook with each step, threatening to fold. She pulled, and somewhere in the middle of that long, impossible hall, somewhere in the burning and the cold, and the gouged scar stretching out behind her, a strange thing happened. The fear left her. Not because the danger had passed. The danger was closer than ever. But there was no room left for fear inside a body working that hard. Fear lives in the space between what you could do and what you're afraid to do. And she had closed that space. She was doing the thing. There was nothing left to be afraid of, because there was nothing left in reserve to spend on being afraid. She was just a woman and a rope and a weight and a slope. And slowly, terribly, foot by foot, the rocks came closer. She did not know how long it took. Long enough that the light changed twice more. Long enough that her hands, when she finally let go of the rope, would not fully open again for some minutes. Long enough that the storm, when she finally looked up, was no longer a wall on the horizon. It was a ceiling. It had climbed the whole sky while her eyes were on her feet. It hung above her now, low and black and rolling. The bruise spread across the entire world, and the pale gray smear at its base had become a churning curtain. Close, close, closer than 2 hours, closer than 1. The storm was early. She had said 2 hours. She had been wrong. It would be here in minutes. Marit dragged the wagon bed the last few feet into the mouth of the hollow with a strength she did not know she still owned, a strength that came from somewhere past the body, from the place where a person keeps the thing they will not let happen. She would not die in a doorway again. She would not watch helplessly while the storm took what it came for. Not this time. She heaved the wagon bed into position across the center of the hollow's mouth, sideboards facing out, and it sat there, 3 feet high, a barrier of solid wood across the heart of the opening. She let the rope fall from her shoulders. Her collarbone was raw beneath her coat. She did not look at it. She looked at her wall. The wagon bed was 10 feet long. The mouth of the hollow was 18 feet wide. It did not span the whole opening. It covered the center, the deepest part, the part that mattered most. But on either side of it, gaps remained. Open channels of cold air, 3 or 4 feet wide, where the wind could slip past the wood entirely and pour into the shelter and fill it with the very thing she had built to keep out. And above the wagon bed, between the top of those 3-foot sideboards and the overhanging rock, open space, 9 feet of it, a wide black gap where the wind would come straight in over the top. A lesser wall, a wall with holes in it, a strong wall with holes in it. Will get you killed. Her father's voice, clear as the cold. Whole, not strong. Whole. She went to work, and now there was no time at all. Now every motion was a race against a thing she could hear beginning far off to the north. A low hum, deep and growing. The first voice of the storm clearing its throat. The canvas first. She tore the ragged cover free from the wagon's rear bows and dragged it up over the top of the opening, stretching it across that 9-foot gap between the sideboards and the rock. She weighted the top edge with stones jammed into cracks in the overhang. She tied the bottom edge down to the sideboard stakes with short lengths of rope, hacked off the coil with the knife from her father's box. The canvas was torn. It gaped in places. It billowed where the rents in the fabric let the first probing fingers of wind reach through. On its own, it would never have been enough. But it was not meant to stand on its own. She turned to the side gaps, the open channels where wood did not meet stone, and she did the thing the fishermen on the cold shore had done 100 years before she was born. She filled them. She ran down the short slope below the bluff and tore up armfuls of the dead winter grass, knee-high, brown and brittle and rooted thick, and she carried it back in great rough bundles and began to pack it into the gaps, handful after handful, pressing it deep into the crevices between sandstone and wood, pushing it in until no daylight showed through, packing it tighter and tighter, with hands that had stopped feeling anything but the work. She filled the gap on the left until it held. She filled the gap on the right until it held. Where the canvas gaped at the top, she pulled one of her 2 wool blankets from the wagon bed and hung it across the worst of the tear, pinning it with stones wedged into the rock above. Where the bottom of the wagon bed sat uneven on the broken ground, a thin dark line of open air running beneath it, she dropped to her knees and scraped loose soil from the floor of the hollow with her bare hands and packed it against the wood like a mason packing mortar against a foundation stone, pressing it flat. Then more on top of that, sealing the seam where wood met earth. The hum to the north had become a moan. The moan was becoming a voice. She brought the mule in, not for the comfort of it, though she loved the animal and did not want to hear it die. She brought it in because a body that size, at rest, gave off heat the way a small stove gave off heat. and in a sealed space. That heat could be the whole difference between a cold she could survive and a cold she could not. She let it in through a narrow gap she had left at one end of the wagon bed, ducking its head beneath the overhang, easing it sideways through the tight space between rock and wood, murmuring to it the whole way. The old words, the calm words, the words her father used with frightened animals. The mule trembled, but it came. It pressed itself against the back wall of the hollow, into the deepest corner, as if it understood that the back of the cave was the safe place, and lowered its head and waited. And then there was only one thing left. The gap she had led the mule through. A single opening at the end of the wagon bed. The last seam. The last way in. And the storm chose that exact moment to arrive. It did not creep. It did not build. One instant the wind was a moan rising in the north, and the next it struck the bluff with a sound like the whole sky tearing in half, a deep, roaring, physical blow that she felt in the soles of her feet and the marrow of her bones, that pressed against the canvas and bowed the blanket inward, and sent the first hard spray of snow hissing through the open seam beside the mule. The cold came through that gap like a living thing, like a hand reaching in. Marit threw herself at it. She grabbed the second blanket, the last blanket, and crammed it into the opening, and still it was not enough. It sagged, the wind shoved it. Snow drove in around its edges, fine as flour, stinging her face in the half-dark. She needed more. She needed something to seal the edges, to close the seam where the blanket met the wood, and she had used the grass. She had used the soil. She had used both blankets. She had used everything. Her hands flew to her own body, searching, desperate, the wind screaming through the gap and stealing the heat off her skin in great hungry pulls, and her fingers closed on the scarf at her throat. She went still, for just a heartbeat, even now, even with the storm pouring through, because it was his. The scarf had been her husband's, dark wool, worn soft, the last thing of his she had not sold. The last thing of his she still wore against her skin every cold day, the way some people carry a photograph and some carry a name. She carried the rough warmth of a thing he had once worn around his own neck. She had kept it through everything, through the selling off of the whole rest of her life. She had kept it the way she had kept the box of tools, because letting go of it felt like letting go of him, and she was not ready. She had never been ready. She did not know if she would ever be ready. The wind tore at her. The snow blinded her. The mule cried out behind her, and Marit understood, in that frozen second, with perfect and terrible clarity, what the storm was asking her for. It was asking for the last piece of him. It was asking her to take the thing she had carried out of love and grief and guilt for all these years, and stuff it into a crack in a wall to keep the wind out, to use it, to let it stop being a relic of the man she had lost, and become a tool for the woman who intended to live. And there was no time to weep about it. The storm did not pause to let her grieve. It never had. That was the whole cruelty of storms, and the whole lesson of them, she thought, in that splinter of a second, of him walking out into the dark all those years ago, against her warning, smiling, that careless smile. And she thought, maybe, for the first time, She truly thought. He would want me to live. Whatever else had been true between them, whatever she had failed to do, or could not have done, or would spend her whole life wondering about, that much was simple. The man who had smiled at her in that doorway would not want his scarf kept clean and folded over a frozen widow. He would want it doing the one thing that could still be done. He would want it keeping her alive. Marit pulled the scarf from her throat, and with a sound that was half a sob and half a battle cry, lost entirely in the roar of the wind, she jammed it into the last open seam of her wall, packing it deep, pressing it tight against the wood and the blanket and the cold, raw edge of the rock. She pushed soil over it. She pushed grass over that. She pressed it all flat with both ruined hands. And the cold hand that had been reaching through the gap stopped. The snow stopped driving in. The stinging stopped. The terrible, hungry pull of the wind on her skin eased. The seam was sealed. The wall was whole. It would have been a lie to call it strong. A wrecked wagon bed, a torn canvas, 2 blankets, a fistful of dead grass, and a dead man's scarf. Strong was not a word that fit any of it, but it was whole, complete, closed, sealed at every seam. And outside, the storm threw itself against the bluff with everything it had. The full weight of all that gathered pressure finally breaking loose, the wind screaming over the top of the rock and around its edges and past the little sealed pocket of the hollow, as if the hollow were not there at all. As if the land had simply swallowed this one small space, and the storm could not find the way in. Marit sank down against the back wall of the hollow, between the cold stone and the warm, trembling flank of the mule, in the sudden, shocking, blessed stillness. Her throat was bare now. She could feel the cold air on it where the scarf had been for so many years. But the air inside the hollow was still, and still was everything. She had learned that on a cold shore as a child, and she had let herself forget it for a while in the soft middle years when life was kind, and she had relearned it the hardest way a person can. On a night she watched a man walk out a door, and now, here, in the howling dark, she understood it all the way down to the bottom of herself. The storm could not be beaten. It could not be outrun. It could not be argued with or warned or made to listen, any more than the man on the trail had listened, any more than her husband had listened, but it could be let past. It could be sealed out. A person could not stop the storm, but a person could build 4 whole walls and make a small still place inside the fury and simply refuse to let the wind reach in and take them. That was not the same as winning. It was better than winning. It was surviving. Marit pressed her bare hand flat against the rock floor and felt the storm raging on the other side of her wall, the trembling in the bones of the earth itself, the whole vast violence of it spending its strength against 3 walls of stone and 1 wall of wreck and grass and grief. And the wall held. The wall held. She closed her eyes in the dark, the mule breathing slow beside her, the scarf doing its last and finest work in the seam above her head. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had seen the storm coming, and she had not been powerless. She had not stood in a doorway. She had built a wall. And on the other side of it, the storm could scream all it wanted. It was not getting in. The first hour was the worst. The sound alone was enough to break a person who wasn't ready for it. This was not the wind of an ordinary night. This was something older, something that seemed to come from every direction at once. A deep and ceaseless roar that rose and fell in patterns no mind could predict. Now a long, sustained howl, now a sudden, shrieking gust that slammed against the canvas and made the whole wall shudder. The sandstone trembled at her back. She could feel it through her spine, through her palms pressed flat against the floor of the hollow, a deep vibration in the bones of the earth itself, as the full force of the storm struck the bluff face and split and poured around it. Marit sat very still in the dark and listened to a thing that no person should have to listen to alone. And she was alone. Except for the mule, the animal stood pressed into the back corner, head low, flanks heaving, and every so often it would shift its weight and stamp, or let out a low frightened sound that was almost human. Once it kicked, a single hard kick against the wagon bed, born of pure animal terror, and the whole structure shuddered, and for one heart-stopping moment, Marit thought the wall would come apart. She scrambled to it in the dark, both hands out, feeling for the seams, checking the canvas, the blanket, the packed grass, and it held. It had held. The kick had shaken it, but not broken it. "Easy," she said to the mule, her voice almost lost in the roar. "Easy now. There's nowhere to run." I know. There was nowhere to run. That was the truth of it. The animal could feel the storm and wanted to flee from it, the way every living thing wants to flee from the thing that frightens it. But you cannot run from a storm. You can only seal yourself away from it and wait. Twice in that first hour, the canvas tore partly free. The wind found a corner where she had not tied it tight enough, and it worked at that corner with a patience that felt almost alive, prying and tugging until the rope slipped and the fabric began to peel back, and a stream of cold and snow came pouring in. Both times Marit crawled forward in the pitch dark to fix it. She could not see. The blackness inside the hollow was total now, so complete that she could not tell whether her eyes were open or shut. So she worked by feel alone. Her fingers, so cold they had nearly stopped reporting back to her, found the loose rope, found the stake, and tied the knots she could not see, pressing the canvas back into place by touch and memory. Her father had taught her to tie knots in the dark, on the cold shore, as a girl. He had blindfolded her with his own scarf and made her tie them over and over until her hands knew the shapes without her eyes. "A storm doesn't bring a lamp," he'd told her. "And the worst trouble always comes at night. Your hands have to know the work, little one. Your hands, not your eyes." She had thought it a strange game then. She did not think it strange now. Now, in the screaming dark, with her life depending on knots she could not see. She blessed him for it, that patient, stubborn man, dead these many years, reaching across all that time to tie her wall shut with the memory of his hands guiding hers. By the end of that first hour, something began to change. She noticed it first in the grass. The dead winter grass she had packed into the side gaps by the handful, pressing it deep into the crevices between wood and stone. It had begun to freeze. The cold and the driving moisture worked into it, and the residual damp in the stems crystallized into ice, and the ice bound the fibers together, fusing the loose, packed grass into something solid. Something hard, what she had stuffed in by hand as a crude, desperate filling, was becoming, within that first hour, a frozen wall of its own. Still not strong, but airtight. The thin streams of cold that had been finding their way through the smallest imperfections began, one by one, to stop. And then she noticed the snow. The snow that drove against the outside of her wall was not simply battering it, it was building on it, packing against the wagon bed, against the canvas, against the frozen grass, layer upon layer, driven so hard by the wind that it pressed itself into every crack and seam and sealed them from the outside. Marit pressed her hand against the inner face of the wall and understood. The storm was burying her, and in burying her, it was insulating her. A sound came out of her in the dark that was almost a laugh, because here was a thing her father had never quite said in words, a thing she was only now, in the howling black, beginning to understand all the way through. The storm was not only her enemy, the very thing that wanted to kill her. The wind, the snow, the cold, was with every passing minute building a thicker and thicker wall around her. The harder it blew, the more snow it packed against her shelter. The more snow it packed, the warmer and stiller the inside became. The fury of the storm was making her safer. She had spent the whole morning fighting the storm, hauling against it, racing it, sealing herself away from it with the last of her strength and the last of her grief. And now, sealed away, she sat in the dark and felt the storm, helping her, doing her work for her, pressing the finest seal against every gap she had not quite managed to close herself. It was the strangest mercy she had ever known. The thing you could not beat. The thing you could not outrun. The thing that took the people you loved and would not listen and would not stop. If you stopped fighting it head on, if you simply built your walls and let it come, it would spend all its terrible strength on the outside of those walls, and in spending it, it would seal you in and keep you and let you live. No one was stronger than the storm. There was no surviving it by being stronger. You survived it by becoming a small, whole, still place that the storm could rage against forever and never reach the center of. The first hour ended, the wall held, and in the second hour, Marit Halverson began, at last, to be still. The roar settled into something steadier. The gusts still came, but the panic of them had passed, and a kind of grim rhythm took its place. The cold inside the hollow deepened slowly, like water cooling in a kettle rather than heat being ripped away by force. She pulled her coat tight. She pressed herself into the warm flank of the mule, and the animal, calmer now too, leaned back into her, and the two of them shared what heat they had in the dark. And with the work done, and nothing left to do but wait, the memories came. She did not invite them. A person never invites these, but in a dark that complete, in a stillness that deep, with the whole roaring world sealed away on the other side of a wall, there is nothing left to keep the past at bay. So it came, and the first thing it brought her was his face. She had not let herself look at it, full on, in a long time. It hurt too much to look at directly, the way the sun hurts to look at, and so she had kept it at the edges of her vision, a warmth she felt but did not face. But here, in the dark, she let herself look. He had been a laughing man. That was the first thing, the thing that had drawn her across a crowded room in another life, when she was young and the world had not yet taught her what it would teach her. He laughed easily. He found the light in things, where she was careful and watchful, a builder's daughter who read weather and measured twice. He was open and easy and sure that things would work out, because for him, mostly, they always had. She had loved that about him. She had loved the way his certainty made room for her carefulness, the way he would tease her gently for worrying, and then, more often than not, quietly do the thing she'd worried about anyway, because he trusted her even when he laughed at her. They had been happy. That was the part the grief always tried to take from her, the memory that they had been happy. The bad ending had a way of reaching back and poisoning everything before it, painting the whole marriage in the color of its last night. But they had been happy. For years, in a small life with small means that had nonetheless been full. She made herself remember that. There in the dark, she made herself remember the good, because the storm could have her fear and her grief, but it could not have the good. The good was hers. She would not let even this take the good. And then, because you cannot remember a person without remembering how you lost them. The dark brought her the last night. She had seen it coming. That was always where it began. That was the splinter that had lived in her for all these years. She had felt the warning in her chest, the same warning she had felt on the ridge that very morning. The flat light, the dropping wind, the terrible stillness. She had known in her body, the way her father had taught her to know, that something was coming, and it was coming fast. And she had gone to him and said the true thing. Don't go out tonight, please. It's coming. I can feel it. And he had smiled at her. That smile, that easy, careless, beloved smile. You worry too much, he'd said, and he had touched her face with one cold hand, gentle, sure. A little weather never hurt anybody. I'll be back before dark. The work won't wait. The work won't wait. How many times had she heard those words from how many men? The work won't wait. As if the work were a living thing with rights of its own. As if a wife's certainty, a woman's knowing, a daughter of a shipwright's read on a darkening sky, weighed nothing at all against the great unquestionable weight of the work. She had stood in the doorway, and she had watched him go, and the dark thing she had carried ever since, the thing that came to her at night and would not be reasoned away, was not grief. Grief she could have lived with. Grief was clean. Grief was love with nowhere to go. What she carried was worse than grief. It was the question. If she had been more, if her warning had carried more weight, if her voice had been a voice he had to listen to instead of a voice he could smile at and set aside, would he have stayed? If she had grabbed him, blocked the door, refused, screamed, fought him the way you fight for a life, would he be alive? She would never know. That was the cruelty that had no bottom. There was no answer. There would never be an answer. She had done the one thing a person can do for another. She had seen the danger and she had named it, and it had not been enough. And she would spend the rest of her life not knowing whether anything would have been enough, whether she could have done more, whether the failure was the world's or whether some part of it, some small, terrible part, was hers. In the dark of the hollow, Marit Halverson spoke aloud. Just one word. His name. It was lost instantly in the roar of the storm. No one heard it. The mule's ear flicked, that was all. But she had said it. For the first time in a very long time, she had said his name out loud. Into the dark, into the storm, and she had not broken. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you it was coming. I felt it. I felt it the way I felt it today." The wind screamed against the wall, and you smiled at me, and you went anyway. And I have spent all this time, wondering if I should have stopped you, if I could have, if a better wife, a stronger woman, a louder voice would have stopped you. She pressed her face against the warm flank of the mule. And do you know what I have decided, here, tonight, in this hole in the ground? The storm did not answer. He did not answer. There was no answer to be had. But she answered herself, and the answer surprised her, because it was not the answer she had been carrying. It was a new one. It had come to her somewhere in the long dark, somewhere between the first terrible hour and the deep stillness of now, brought up out of the bottom of herself by the sound of the storm and the memory of his face and the strange mercy of a snow that buried in order to save. "I think," she said slowly into the dark, "that some storms cannot be stopped." The wind howled. "I think there are men who will walk out the door no matter who stands in it. I think there are people who will not listen, no matter how true the thing you tell them is, no matter how much you love them, no matter how clearly you see what they cannot." She thought of the big man on the trail, the one who had laughed at her, the one who had ridden south into the open with the storm leaning over him. She had told him the truth, too, and he had smiled in his own hard way and gone anyway. She had not killed that man by failing to convince him. He had chosen the open trail, the way her husband had chosen the door. "I gave you the truth," she whispered. "I gave you everything I had to give. I saw the storm, and I named it, and I begged you. And you chose. You chose. Not me. You." The words shook in her chest. "It was not my failure that you would not listen. It was not because I was a woman, or because my voice was small, or because I should have been more. I was enough. The warning was enough. The truth was enough." She was crying now, in the dark, silently, the tears freezing on her face almost as they fell. "You just didn't listen. And that was yours to answer for. Not mine. Not mine. I have carried it as mine for so long, and it was never mine. It was yours, and I am setting it down." She had said that very morning on the ridge that she would carry the ache later, that she had work to do first. Well, it was later now, and she found, to her astonishment, that she could not pick the ache back up in the old shape. The shape had changed. It had changed somewhere in the dark, sealed in this small, still place, while the storms did its work outside. It was not gone. Grief is never gone. She would carry the loss of him until the day she died, and she did not want to be free of that, because the loss was made of love, and she would not give up the love to be free of the loss. But the guilt, the question that had no answer, the terrible weight of believing that if she had only been more, he would be alive. That she could set down. And as she set it down, something else came loose with it. Something older. Something deeper. Because the guilt had only ever been one face of a thing that had two. The other face was the doubt. For her whole life, the world had taught her to mistrust her own knowing. Because she was a girl, because she was a woman, because she was a wife and then a widow, and then a woman alone, on a road with a broken wagon. They had taught her so patiently, so thoroughly, that some part of her had come to believe it, had wondered, even on the morning her husband died, even as her whole body screamed that the storm was real, whether she was only a worried woman after all, only an overcautious wife. She had let the world's doubt crawl inside her and make a home there, and it had cost her more than that one terrible night. It had cost her every day since. Every day she had carried a failure that was never hers, because she had been trained, from the cradle, to believe that when a thing went wrong, it must somehow trace back to her not being enough. But the storm had just settled that question. Once. For all of it. She had read the flat light and the dropping wind and the bruise on the sky, and she had been right. She had told the big man he could not outrun it, and she had been right. She had seen exactly what was coming, and built exactly what was needed, and she was alive at the bottom of a buried hollow because of it. Her knowing had saved her. The same knowing the world had spent her whole life telling her to doubt. The guilt had been about one night. The doubt had been about a lifetime. And in the long dark, sealed inside her own small hole place, she let go of both of them at once. What other people did with the truth she gave them was never hers to control, only hers to grieve. And to grieve a thing is not the same as to have failed at it. Sometimes you see clearly and speak truly and build the wall and hold the door, and you lose what you love anyway, because the world is large and storms are real, and other people have wills of their own that no amount of love can overrule. To lose someone is not always to have failed them, and the only thing left to do when you have done everything right and lost them all the same, is to refuse to lose yourself in the bargain, to build a wall around the small, still place at your center, to seal every seam, and to let the grief rage on the outside of it all at once, while you live. Marit Halverson leaned her head back against the cold stone wall of the hollow, and she breathed, slow and deep, the way her father had taught her to breathe when the feelings were too big to carry. And for the first time in more years than she could count, the breath went all the way down. There was no clock in the hollow, no way to measure the hours but the slow turning of her own thoughts and the changing voice of the storm. And the storm's voice was changing. The howl, which had been so sharp and close in the first hour, had grown muffled, distant, as though she were hearing it now from inside a mountain, rather than from behind a single wall of wreckage and grass. The snow had buried them. The drift outside had risen and risen as the wind packed it against the bluff, until the hollow was sealed beneath a deep white blanket that swallowed sound and held in heat. The trembling in the rock had softened. The thin, probing fingers of cold that had found their way through the early gaps had stopped entirely. Inside, the air was cold, but it was still, and still was everything. Marit ate a little, a piece of dried meat, a square of hardtack. She drank a mouthful of water from the tin canteen she'd kept inside her coat, against her body, so it would not freeze. The mule had quieted completely now, its breathing slow and deep beside her, its great warm body radiating heat into her side like a banked fire. She had not meant to sleep. She knew the danger of sleeping in the cold. Her father had warned her of it. The cold makes a person tired, and the tired makes them careless, and the careless do not wake. But she had hauled 300 pounds across 400 yards. She had torn her hands raw. She had wept out a grief she had carried for years. Her body had given everything it had. And now, in the warmth of the mule and the stillness of the sealed hollow, it simply stopped. She slept, and in her sleep, she did not dream of the storm. She dreamed of the cold shore. She dreamed she was small again, in a coat too big for her, standing on a headland beside a man with rough hands and endless patience. The wind was blowing, but it did not frighten her, because his hand was on her shoulder, large and warm and sure. And he was pointing down at the little hut tucked into the face of the cliffs. "You see, little one," he was saying in the dream, in the voice she had not heard in waking life for so long. "You see how they last? No fire, no stove, nothing to make warmth at all. And still the men inside live through the worst nights the sea can send." "How?" the small Maret asked in the dream, the way she had asked in life. And her father crouched down to her level, the way he had, and he smiled the slow smile he saved for the things that mattered most. But this time, in the dream, he said something he had never said in life. "The same way you will someday," he told her, "when your own storm comes. And it will come, little one. It comes for everyone. The trick is not to be afraid of it. The trick is to know, all the way down, that the storm is not the end of you. You build your walls. You seal your seams. You make a small, still place. And you wait. And the storm passes. It always passes." "And then what?" the small Maret asked. Her father stood and looked out at the gray water, and the wind moved his hair, and he was so real in the dream that she could smell the wood shavings and the salt of him. "And then," he said, "you dig yourself out, and you walk on, carrying whatever you have left, into whatever comes next." She woke in darkness so complete she could not tell if her eyes were open. The mule was breathing beside her, slow and steady. The storm was a low moan now, far away, almost gentle. She had slept, and she had woken, and she was alive. She reached out and touched the wagon bed. It was cold, but dry. She touched the canvas above her. It was rigid, frozen solid, coated on the outside with a shell of ice and packed snow that had turned her improvised wall into something almost as solid as the rock around it. She touched the place where the scarf was sealed into the seam. His scarf, doing its last work, keeping her alive. And touching it did not hurt the way she had feared it would. There was no betrayal in it, no fresh tearing of the old wound. It felt instead like him helping her. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, that the last warm thing he had left her should be the thing that kept the cold out on the worst night of her life, in the small, still place she had built to save herself. He could not stay, all those years ago, when she'd asked him to, but he was here now, in a way. The warmth of a thing he had worn was sealed into the wall that was keeping her breathing. "Thank you," she whispered to the scarf, to him, to the dark. And she meant it, not as grief, as gratitude. She sat in the deep stillness a long time after that, neither sleeping nor fully waking, in a kind of peace she had not known in years. The storm had been raging outside her wall for hours upon hours. It was still raging now, somewhere far above the snow that had buried her. It would rage for hours more. But it could not reach her. She had built a place it could not reach. And inside that place, in the dark, with the warmth of a mule, and the warmth of a dead man's scarf, and the warmth of a grief that had finally changed its shape, Marit Halvorsen was not dying. She was healing. She had walked into the hollow as a woman who would never know whether she could have saved the man she loved. She would walk out of it as a woman who finally understood that the question itself had been the wrong one all along. And she would walk out trusting at last the one voice the world had spent her whole life teaching her to silence, her own. She would never again let anyone tell her she did not know what she knew. Not a stranger on a trail, not a memory in a doorway, not the small doubting voice that the world had planted in her own chest so long ago she had mistaken it for her own. That voice could rage all it liked. She had sealed it out, the same as the wind. The moan of the storm went on. And slowly, so slowly she could not say when it began, a change came into the dark, a faint luminosity, the barest grayness. Along the top edge of the frozen canvas, where the ice had cracked just slightly in the settling of the snow, the smallest, palest light began to seep through. It was not the storm. It was something on the far side of the storm. It was the first gray promise of an end. Marit Halvorsen lifted her face toward that faint and distant light. The cold air bare against her throat where the scarf had been, the warm mule breathing slow beside her, the small, still place she had built, holding firm against a fury that was, at last, beginning to spend itself out. She had built 4 whole walls. She had sealed every seam. She had let the storm pass over her, the way a stone in a river lets the water go around it. Not because the stone is stronger than the river, but because the stone is whole. And on the far side of the longest dark she had ever known, the light was coming back. The silence, when it came, was the most startling thing of all. It did not fade. It did not soften by degrees. One moment there was the long, low moan of the storm spending the last of itself far above the snow. And the next there was nothing. Nothing at all. A silence so complete that the ear began to invent sounds to fill it. A ringing. A hum. The slow pulse of her own blood moving past her eardrum. Marit sat in that silence a long time before she trusted it. She had learned, on the cold shore, that a storm can pause, that it can hold its breath, and trick you into the open, and then fall on you again with everything it had been saving. So she waited. She waited until the silence had gone on so long that it could only be the real thing, the true after, the far side. And then she began to dig. The snow had drifted deep against the wall, packed hard by the wind, and she dug at it with her hands and with the flat of her father's hatchet, breaking through the frozen crust the storm had built, the crust that had sealed her in and kept her alive. She dug toward the faint gray light, and then her hand broke through into open air, and a wash of cold poured in, clean and sharp and still, and she pulled the gap wider and wider and crawled out of the small dark place she had built into a world remade. Everything was white. Every feature of the land she had crossed the day before was gone. The trail was gone. The brush was gone. The shallow draw and the gouged scar her wagon bed had cut in the frost. All of it gone, erased, buried beneath a smooth, unbroken blanket that stretched in every direction to a horizon nearly impossible to tell from the pale sky above it. The world had been wiped clean, and it was silent. And it was still. The cold was deep, deeper than the day before, a cold that bit at her bare throat and burned in her lungs. But there was no wind, none at all, and without the wind, the cold was a thing she could bear, present and patient, but no longer a thief. Just the cold, sitting there, the way her father had told her it would, when the wind that weaponized it had finally gone. Marit turned and looked back at what she had built, and she almost could not find it. From the outside, the shelter had vanished. The wagon bed was buried to its upper edge. The canvas above was a smooth shell of ice, blended into the rock face as though it had grown there. The grass-packed sides had disappeared entirely beneath the drift. It looked like part of the bluff, a natural fold in the stone, a place where rock and snow had always met in exactly this way. If she had not built it herself, with her own raw hands, she would have walked past it and never known a soul had lived through the night inside. She stood there in the white and the cold and the enormous silence, and she looked at the thing she had made from a wreck and a fistful of grass and the last warm relic of a man she had loved. And pride was not quite the word for what rose in her. It was something quieter and steadier and harder to shake. She felt true. She dug out the gap and led the mule up and out into the white, and the animal stood blinking in the sudden brightness, its breath rising in thick white columns that hung in the still air without moving, without drifting, standing like pillars of smoke in the frozen morning. It was gaunt. It was shaking, but it was alive. "Come on, then," she said softly, and her voice was strange in all that silence. "We're not staying here." She got her bearings from the sun, low and pale, in a sky scrubbed clean, south and a little east, toward her brother, toward the only family she had left. And she began to walk, leading the mule across a buried world, following the arc of the sun, because there were no landmarks left to follow. She had gone perhaps a mile when she found them. It was the wagon she saw first, the traveler's wagon, the one that had turned south down the open trail while she warned them not to. It sat half buried in a long drift, tilted at a broken angle, the team gone, the canvas torn loose and frozen stiff. Abandoned. Marit stopped, and a cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled into her chest. She had hoped she was wrong about them. She had hoped, in the long dark, with a real and aching hope, that somehow the big man's confidence had carried them through, that his 100 crossings had counted for something after all. But the open trail did not care how many times a man had crossed it. The wind out there, on that exposed ground, with nothing to break it. She did not let herself finish the thought. She had seen, once, what such a wind could do to those left out in it. She did not need to picture it now. She stood beside the foundered wagon in the terrible silence, and there was no triumph in her, no thin, cold satisfaction of having been proved right. There was only grief, because being right had never been the thing she wanted. She had not warned them to win an argument. She had warned them because she had seen what was coming, and she had not wanted it to take them. And it had taken them anyway. the way it took her husband, the way it takes the ones who will not hear. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty wagon, to the gray-haired woman who had almost believed her, to the big, hard man who never would. "I'm so sorry. I tried. I did try." And then, beyond the wagon, in the shelter of a low shelf of rock half a mile on, something moved. Marit went still. A small, dark shape against all that white, moving, upright. She left the mule and she ran, stumbling through the deep snow, her heart slamming, and the shape resolved as she came closer into a figure, bundled and frost-rimed, struggling out of a hollow in the rocks. It was the girl from the wagon, the one with the watching eyes, the one who had raised her hand, not in farewell, but in something closer to an apology. She was alive, half frozen, gaunt with cold, her lips cracked and her eyes huge in a pale face, but alive. And behind her, in the hollow she'd been digging out of, the older gray-haired woman, moving slow, but moving. Alive. The girl saw Marit coming, and her face broke open, and she stumbled forward, and the two of them met in the snow and held on to each other without a word, because there were no words for it, because some things are too large for words. When at last the girl could speak, her voice was a cracked whisper. "You said," she managed, "you said, find walls, block the wind, not the cold, the wind." Marit held her tighter. When Caleb's wagon went down, the others scattered, ran for the settlement. But I remembered what you said. I pulled her. She looked back at the older woman. I pulled her off the trail and into the rocks. I found 3 sides of stone, and I blocked the open side with everything we had, the way you said. The seat cushions, the canvas, our own coats stuffed in the gaps. And then we held on to each other. And we waited. The girl was weeping now, the tears freezing on her face. Everyone laughed at you. Caleb laughed at you. And you were the only one who was right. And it saved us. A thing you said, in 2 minutes, to people who laughed at you. It saved our lives. Marit Halverson stood in the snow, holding a half-frozen girl who was alive because of words the world had told her to doubt. And the last broken thing inside her quietly finished healing. She had spent her whole life being dismissed, smiled at, set aside, told gently and cruelly that she could not possibly know what she knew. And here, in the white silence, was the proof of what her knowing was worth. Not because the crowd had finally listened. The crowd never listens. The big man laughed and rode into the open, and the storm took him, the way it takes all the ones who will not hear. But one person had listened. One girl, in a wagon, who had raised her hand, and one was enough. One was always enough. You do not need the whole world to hear you. You never did. You need one person to carry the true thing forward, and a true thing, once carried, does not stop. It moves on. It saves a life you will never take credit for, in a hollow in the rocks, on the far side of a storm. Marit had spent so long grieving the warning that came true and saved no one. And here, at last, was a warning that came true and saved someone. It did not undo the past. Nothing undoes the past, but it laid something new over it. The way the snow had laid something white and whole over the broken land, not erasing the scars beneath, but covering them, ending their reign, letting something fresh begin on top of what had been lost. They walked on together. A woman, a girl, an older woman, and a gaunt and faithful mule, moving south and east across a buried world, following the arc of the pale sun. It took them the rest of that day and into the next before they saw the thin gray thread of smoke that meant a homestead. Before a figure came running out across the snow, stumbling, calling a name. Her brother, Soren. He had believed her dead. Word had reached his door of a storm that had caught travelers on the open road, and that no one caught in the open had been found alive. He had grieved her already. He had said the words over her in his heart, and made his peace with the empty place where his sister had been. And then she walked out of the white, leading a mule and a girl and an old woman, gaunt and frost-scarred and entirely alive. He could not speak for a long time. He stood in the snow and looked at her the way a person looks at something they have already mourned and accepted as gone. And then he crossed the distance between them in great floundering strides, and wrapped her in his arms, and held her as though she might vanish if he let go. That night, by the warmth of his stove, wrapped in blankets, with the girl and the old woman fed and sleeping, and the mule safe and warm in the barn, Soren asked her how she had known, how she had lived, how she had done what the storm would not let anyone else do. And Marit told him about the flat light and the dropping wind, about the rocks and the 3 walls, and the 4th she had built from a wreck, about the grass that froze into a seal, and the snow that buried her and kept her, and the long dark night, and the things she had finally understood inside it. She told him about the scarf, and her voice did not break when she said it. It held steady and warm and sure. When she finished, Soren was quiet for a long while, looking at his sister's raw hands and cracked lips, and the new and steady thing in her eyes that had not been there before. Then he said something she would carry for the rest of her life. "You didn't survive the storm," he said slowly. "That's not the right word for it. The storm was bigger than you. It was bigger than anybody." He shook his head, searching for it. "You made it go around you, like a stone in a river. The river doesn't beat the stone, and the stone doesn't beat the river. The stone just stays whole, and the water has to go around." He looked at her. "You stayed whole, Marit. After everything, after him, after all of it, you stayed whole." And she found, sitting there in the warmth, that for once she could simply agree. For so long she had measured herself against what the world had wanted her to be. Louder, stronger, a voice that men had no choice but to obey. And by that measure, she had always come up short, every day of her life, and had carried the shortfall like a stone in her chest. But the storm had never once asked her to be strong. It had only asked her to leave it no way in, and that she had always been able to do. She had done it with grass and canvas and a dead man's scarf, on the worst day of her life, with an hour to spare, and a tired mule for company. She had only needed one long dark night to learn that she had been able to do it all along. The hollow in the bluff stayed sealed beneath the snow for the rest of that long, cold season. When the warmth finally came and the drifts melted away, the wreckage of it lay there in the rocks. A wagon bed wedged into a fold of stone, scraps of frozen canvas, dried grass still packed into the seams, the faint marks of a mule's hooves in the softening ground. In time, the wood rotted. The canvas fell to pieces. The rope returned to the soil. And the hollow became, once more, simply an empty curve in the stone, shaped by wind, waiting for nothing. No one who passed it ever knew what it had been. No one knew a woman had built 4 whole walls there in an hour, with a storm coming down, and lived a whole night inside the fury, and walked out the other side healed of a wound she had carried for years. No one knew. And it did not matter that no one knew, because the girl knew. The girl who grew into a woman, who never forgot the day a stranger in a broken wagon told her the truth that everyone else laughed at, and who told it in turn to her own children on cold nights beside a warm fire. The cold doesn't kill you. The wind does. You don't beat the storm. You build your walls. You seal your seams. You make a small, still place, and you let it pass around you, and you come out the other side, carrying whatever you have left, and you walk on. And Marit, she stayed, with Soren, that first hard winter. And then, when the spring came, she did not move on alone. The girl had no people left of her own, and a woman who has learned that one person listening is enough does not turn away the one person who listened. So they built a life, small, plain, full in the way the old life had been full, before the doorway and the long years after. Marit grew older in it. Her hair went gray and then white, and her hands, which had hauled 300 pounds across 400 yards of frozen ground, grew slow and knotted and tender. And the world began to do to her the thing the world does to women who grow old. It began to speak past her, to look through her, to assume that her knowing had gone quiet along with her hair, that she was a thing to be cared for now rather than listened to, that whatever she had once seen so clearly, she could not possibly see any more. But Marit Halvorsen had been dismissed before. She had been dismissed her whole life, by the men on the trail, by a husband in a doorway, by the small doubting voice the world had planted in her own chest when she was young. And she had buried that voice in a wall of grass and snow on the worst night of her life, and she had never let it back in. So when the world spoke past her now, she only smiled the slow smile her father used to smile, the one he saved for the things that mattered most. And she went right on knowing exactly what she knew. If this story found its way to you and held you here to the end, perhaps it is because somewhere in it you recognized something. Not the snow, not the rocks, not a wagon torn apart by a woman's raw hands, but the storm, your storm, the one you saw coming that no one else believed, the loss you were told you should be over by now, the knowing in your own chest that the world has spent a lifetime teaching you to doubt. Perhaps you have stood in a doorway once and watched someone walk away into a thing you could see, and they could not. Perhaps you have carried a weight that was never yours to carry. The belief that to lose someone is the same as to fail them. It is not the same. Sometimes you do everything right. You see clearly, you speak truly, you hold the door, and you lose what you love anyway, because the world is large and storms are real, and other people have wills that no amount of love can overrule. To lose is not always to have failed, and being dismissed by the many does not mean you were wrong. You only ever needed one person to hear the true thing, and on the hardest nights, that one person is yourself. So if you are older now, and the world has begun to speak past you, as though your knowing has gone quiet with your hair. Remember the widow in the rocks. Remember that wisdom dismissed is still wisdom, that a life broken into pieces can still build a shelter that holds, that you are not finished, not while you can still see the storm clearly, and name it truly, and make of yourself a small, whole, still place that no fury can reach the center of. The storm always passes, it always has. And on the far side of it, the light comes back, and you dig yourself out, and you walk on, carrying whatever still matters into whatever comes next. Whole. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, events, and places within it are entirely imagined, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to actual events, is purely coincidental.